Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday everybody. Multiple outlets are reporting that the European Union and China are set to hold a summit on the 7th and 8th of December. The European Commission and Council presidents will travel to China for the first in-person summit with Beijing's leadership in 4 years. With this news, let's begin today's video with recent developments in EU-China relations. While relations are not as adversarial as those between the US and China, they are not particularly positive either. And the EU is in the middle of a once-in-a-generation policy debate about what its China policy should be. There are two major issues for the Europeans: Beijing's support for Russia and trade. On Thursday last week, speaking at the 14th Caixin Summit in China, the European Commission's Executive Vice President and Commissioner for Trade, Dombrovskis, said that a substantial reduction in the EU-China trade deficit was necessary, expressing, quote, "I must be frank, the EU-China relationship is being tested. The EU trade deficit with China stands at nearly 400 billion euros, $427.8 billion in 2022. Even if it's expected to decrease in 2023, it is clear that a substantial balancing is necessary," end quote. We will be discussing the trade imbalances and what this means for global constraints on Chinese growth later in today's video. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reports that in multiple speeches this week, the EU's leadership dangled the prospect of more adversarial trade policies should China not open its market to European firms and stop what they perceive as economic bullying. They also slammed what they said were Beijing's disruptive influence on the global stage, the outlet writes, at a time when multiple conflicts are swirling close to EU borders. Quote, "Despite a stream of high-level European visits to China in recent months, frustration is mounting that Beijing is unwilling to yield on any substantive points," end quote. We'll touch on this again shortly. Meanwhile, as regular viewers know, the Netherlands in the EU, along with Japan and East Asia, is a key player in the United States' ongoing efforts to restrict the export of advanced chip-making equipment to China. In a phone call last week, China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, urged the new Dutch foreign minister to continue cooperating in fields such as technology and supply chains before export controls on Dutch chip-making equipment come into force. China's imports from the Netherlands soared last month as Chinese companies appear to have been stockpiling high-tech chip-making equipment before export controls take effect next year. In September, Chinese imports of the machines from the Netherlands rose by 1,850% to $1.3 billion year on year. The increase in August was 343%, and in July, 1,677%. China's own chip-making equipment systems still lag far behind the Dutch multinational ASML and Japan's Nikon. In the phone conversation, the two sides also exchanged opinions on China-Europe relations. Wang Yi said that there was no fundamental conflict of interests between China and Europe, with consensuses far outweighing differences. Quote, "China-Europe relations do not depend on and should not be interfered with by any third party," end quote, a thinly veiled swipe at the United States. However, while the technology restrictions are part of US foreign policy, to say that Europeans have no complaints of their own towards China is a bit of a stretch, to put it mildly. Indeed, we will end part 1 on EU-China relations with the next piece. In his most recent monthly so-called Watching China in Europe article, US-based Rhodium Group senior advisor Noah Barkin has unpacked the current sentiment in elite EU circles on the eve of bilateral talks in Beijing. Quote, "EU leaders will travel to Beijing in early December for what is shaping up to be another tense sparring session with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Since her last summit meeting with Xi, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has presented plans to restrict the flow of sensitive technologies to China and launched an anti-subsidy probe into electric vehicle imports from the EU's top trading partner. And there is a possibility, several officials in Brussels and other capitals told me, that the Commission will deliver another blow in the weeks leading up to the summit by imposing export curbs on a handful of Chinese entities that are sending dual-use items to Russia. This would be part of the EU's 12th sanctions package. Sanctions circumvention risks turning into a major theme in the run-up to the EU-China summit, for which expectations are already rock bottom. EU officials have come away frustrated from a series of high-level visits to Beijing in recent months that were meant to prepare the ground for the summit. People who took part in these discussions said their Chinese interlocutors were stuck on old talking points, lashing out at the United States and complaining about the EU's 4-year-old description of China as a systemic rival, while dismissing European concerns about overcapacity in a wide range of Chinese industrial sectors that Brussels views as a growing threat. We had these dialogues, we wanted meaningful outcomes, but we haven't had them. It's that simple. An EU official involved in the summit preparations said, "The Chinese system seems incapable of acknowledging our concerns, let alone addressing them, so we will simply turn the screws one more time." End quote. Next up, the Chinese economy, we look at employment and global constraints on Chinese growth. If you're getting some value from today's episode, as always, don't forget to hit the like button. Sharing and subscribing is a big help, and Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below for anyone who wants to go the extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable. Next up, in the second half of today's video, we move to the economy. Over the weekend, as usual, dozens of long articles on the Chinese economy of varying degrees when it comes to quality were published. For today, we look at excerpts from two particularly good examples of these. The first is from Chinese financial media outlet Caixin, which published a great piece on the current employment situation in the country. According to data from the National Bureau of Statistics, China's surveyed urban unemployment rate was 5% in September, a significant improvement from last year's peak of 6.1% in April and 5.7% recorded late last year. The job market appears to have rebounded, surpassing even the levels in late 2019 and most of that year. By this gauge alone, and of course ignoring youth unemployment, it would seem that China's employment has fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels. However, the Caixin article argues that this gauge is deceptive. Quote, "We must exercise caution when looking at the surveyed urban unemployment rate and complement it with other data to gain a comprehensive view of the employment situation." End quote. Other economic data suggest a less positive reading of the unemployment data. First, the People's Bank of China's Urban Depositor Survey. In the second quarter, 43.7% of surveyed urban depositors perceived the employment situation as either hard or uncertain, a significant increase from the 33.4% recorded in the fourth quarter of 2019. Second, the employment gauge in the Consumer Confidence Index. In August, the gauge stood at 76, a notable drop from the 132.9 in December 2019. During the same period, the measures for job satisfaction and expectations both showed similar declines. Third, from the business perspective, the gauges for employment in the National Bureau of Statistics manufacturing and non-manufacturing PMIs are telling. As the chart shows, the weighed gauge for September was 47. That's noticeably lower than the readings in 2019, says the article, which fluctuated between 48 and 49. The Caixin author concludes that the gauges, quote, "all indicate that employment remains under considerable pressure," end quote. Adding, quote, "given the current employment situation, the surveyed urban unemployment rate as a single metric is likely to have underestimated the employment pressures. Currently, insufficient domestic demand remains a key challenge to China's economy, underscoring the urgent need to strengthen macroeconomic policies for which the country still has ample room. It's necessary to make good use of this room to drive high quality and reasonable economic growth." End quote. The second article is from Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis, who we often quote on this channel, which he published in the UK-based Financial Times, and which discusses why global constraints is just another factor behind the end of high-speed Chinese growth. We end today's episode by quoting selected excerpts from the piece directly. Investment accounts for roughly 24% of global gross domestic product, and consumption the remaining 76%. Even in the highest investing economies, the actual investment share of GDP rarely exceeds 32 to 34%, except for short periods of time. China, however, is an extreme outlier. Investment last year accounted for around 43% of its GDP and has averaged well above 40% for the past 30 years. Consumption, on the other hand, accounts for roughly 54% of China's GDP. Put another way, while China accounts for 18% of global GDP, it accounts for only 13% of global consumption and an astonishing 32% of global investment. Every dollar of investment in the global economy is balanced by $3.2 of consumption, and by $4.1 in the world, excluding China. In China, however, it is offset by only $1.3 of consumption. What is more, if China were to grow by 4 to 5% a year on average for the next decade, while maintaining its current reliance on investment to drive that growth, its share of global GDP would rise to 21% over the decade. But its share of global investment would rise much more, to 37%. Alternatively, if we assume that every dollar of investment globally should continue to be balanced by roughly $3.2 of consumption, the rest of the world would have to reduce the investment share of its own GDP by a full percentage point a year to accommodate China. Is that likely? Probably not, given that the US, India, and EU, and several other major economies have made very explicit their intentions to expand the role of investment in their own economies. The imbalances may be an even bigger problem when we consider that since 2021, China has been shifting investment away from the bloated property sector towards manufacturing. But if China's share of global GDP rises over the next decade, driven by a continued reliance on manufacturing, how easily can the rest of the world absorb the country's expansion? Currently, the manufacturing sector globally comprises roughly 16% of the world's GDP, and as little as 11% of the US economy. China is once again an outlier, with a manufacturing share of GDP at 27%, higher than that of any other major country. If its economy were to grow over the next decade at 4 to 5% a year, even without a further increase in the manufacturing share of the country's GDP, China's share of global manufacturing would rise from its current 30% to 37%. Can the rest of the world absorb such an increase? The point is that without a major and politically difficult restructuring of its sources of growth away from investment and manufacturing and towards an increasing reliance on consumption, China cannot raise its share of global GDP without an accommodation from an increasingly reluctant rest of the world. Without that continuous accommodation, the global economy would find it extremely difficult to absorb further Chinese growth. Many more years of high growth in China are only possible if the country were to implement a major restructuring of its economy in which a much greater role for domestic consumption replaces its over-reliance on investment and manufacturing. Here ends the direct quote in today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Monday, and I will see you all tomorrow.